It was a tragedy that should never have happened. A crash that took the lives of music legends and left a scar on the world of rock and roll forever. The official report blamed pilot error. Case closed. But what if the truth is far more complex? What if the story we've been told is missing the most bizarre, unexplained pieces of the puzzle? Why was this specific plane doomed from the start? What was the chilling prophecy the frontman uttered just before boarding? And how did a single inexplicable mistake in the cockpit seal their fate? From a warning that was shockingly ignored, to a mechanical ghost that investigators could never solve, to a survival story so strange it defies belief. This is not just the story of a crash. This is the story of the 7 strange things that never ever made sense about the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash. Stick around, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. Following the release of Street Survivors on October 17th, Lynyrd Skynyrd embarked on a major tour throughout the United States. Opting to avoid the hassles of scheduled flights and the fatigue of long bus journeys, the group chose to lease a Convair CV-240 twin-propeller aircraft for their transit between performance locations. This arrangement enabled them to travel to their shows more swiftly and conveniently, fitting their demanding itinerary. Notably, several months earlier, the band Aerosmith had looked into chartering the very same aircraft, but their management team had rejected the idea over safety issues, particularly after seeing the pilot and co-pilot take drinks from a bottle of Jack Daniels during a walkthrough, a choice that potentially averted a disaster. After performing in Lakeland, Florida, Lynyrd Skynyrd traveled on to Greenville, South Carolina, for their next performance on October 19, 1977. Mid-flight, a 10-foot trail of fire and sparks erupted from the right engine. Several members of the band instantly voiced their worries about the aircraft, even informing the frontman, Ronnie Van Zant, that they would quit the tour unless a different plane was secured. Cassie, the backing singer and sister of guitarist Steve Gaines, was so frightened of the aircraft that she preferred riding in the band's packed cargo truck, though Van Zant eventually persuaded her to get on the flight. Changing planes would have meant calling off scheduled performances, a prospect Van Zant was firmly against. He felt the band had an obligation to their dedicated Southern supporters and that they must take that flight one more time. They were unaware of the destiny that lay in store for them. On October 20th, after a powerful show in Greenville, the musicians and their team filed onto the 30-year-old plane that was to carry them to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. At that time, the lineup for Lynyrd Skynyrd featured vocalist Ronnie Van Zant, guitarists Steve Gaines, Alan Collins, and Gary Rossington, drummer Artemis Pyle, bassist Leon Wilkson, and keyboardist Billy Powell. Alongside these principal artists, the group was supported by a trio of skilled female backup vocalists who performed together as the Honkettes. This trio was made up of Leslie Hawkins, JoJo Billingsley, and Cassie Gaines. While boarding the aircraft, Van Zant was overheard trying to comfort Cassie by saying that if your time is up, then it's simply your time. The group's next stop was Louisiana State University, where they had a concert planned for the next evening. The mood was expectant, and enthusiasm was high as they departed. Yet they were entirely unaware that this trip was destined for a catastrophic outcome. Aboard the aircraft were 26 people, counting the musicians, though merely 20 would survive the ordeal. That evening, the initial leg of the 700-mile trip to Baton Rouge proceeded without incident. But as they neared the end, the flight crew made an alarming discovery. The plane was dangerously low on fuel, and catastrophe was imminent. Without warning, the right engine failed. This was the identical engine that had malfunctioned on the prior journey, and in a frantic effort to move fuel from the left engine to the right, the crew mistakenly dumped their remaining fuel supply into the air. Dread ensued when they understood they lacked the necessary fuel to reach the airfield. In a state of despair, the pilots endeavored to alter their route. They targeted the closest airfield, Macomb Pike Airport, situated just outside Macomb, Mississippi, but they were soon met with a grim truth. They did not possess sufficient fuel to arrive there either. Compounding the crisis, at 10,000 feet with no fuel left, the left propeller also quit. The aircraft began to plunge, leaving them with no alternative but to try for an emergency landing in a clear field if they wished to survive. Meanwhile, those in the passenger cabin were completely ignorant of the grave circumstances developing around them. Ronnie Van Zant was curled on the floor in the aisle at the rear, using a pillow and fast asleep. He had been out celebrating the previous night and was in dire need of sleep. Other individuals were engaged in a poker game to occupy themselves. Everything appeared to be a routine flight until the drummer, Artemis Pyle, chose to go to the cockpit to see how the pilots were doing. The instant he stepped inside, an obviously frantic pilot, Walter McCreary, desperately told him to go back to his seat and fasten his belt. The gravity of their plight became instantly apparent, and a wave of acute nervousness rapidly circulated through the cabin. Most occupants sat in petrified quiet, shutting their eyes and tightening their hands, while some offered prayers, hoping for divine intervention. Guitarist Gary Rossington recalled a horrifying sound, resembling hundreds of baseball bats smacking the plane's exterior as it started to collide with the forest. They had overshot the planned emergency site and were compelled to wreck in a marshy, wooded area. As they skimmed the tops of the trees for nearly 1,000 feet, the roaring noise intensified until the aircraft finally stopped after hitting a pine tree 3 feet thick. The collision ripped the aircraft to pieces in the 10 to 12 seconds it took to decelerate from 100 miles per hour to an abrupt standstill. This violent force ejected the occupants from the fuselage onto the wooded terrain. Rossington was knocked unconscious during the impact, and when he came to several minutes later, he discovered himself on the ground with the aircraft's door lying atop him. In his disoriented condition, he surveyed the surroundings and immediately understood the aircraft was totally demolished. The wings and tail section had been ripped away, and the cockpit, holding the deceased pilot, had broken off entirely. The wreckage had slid for 500 feet after the initial impact, scattering debris in its path. In an odd turn of fate, the lack of fuel, which was the original reason for the disaster, proved to be a fortunate circumstance. It stopped the wreckage from igniting and exploding on impact, which likely spared numerous lives. Nevertheless, even without a fire, not everyone was fortunate enough to make it through. Long before that fateful journey, Ronnie Van Zant had often voiced a grim conviction that he would not live to see his 30th birthday. His father recalled their discussions vividly. He told me on numerous occasions, "Daddy, I will never reach the age of 30. I would ask him, "Why do you say things like that? You won't make it to 30. And he would always answer, "Daddy, that is my limit." His bandmates were also no strangers to these disquieting forewarnings. Drummer Artemis Pyle remembered a talk they shared in Tokyo, Japan. Ronnie informed me he would never live past 30 and that he would die with his boots on, meaning while touring. I responded, "Oh, Ronnie, don't say such things." But the man was certain of his fate. Even Ronnie's spouse, Judy, had listened to him speak of his impending destiny so often that she could not ignore it. She stated, "When I learned about the plane crash, I just knew Ronnie was among those who had been lost. He had told me so frequently that I came to understand he truly knew what was going to happen." And tragically, his prediction was, indeed, realized. 87 days before his 30th birthday, Ronnie Van Zant was killed in the terrible air disaster. He was forcibly ejected from his seat, struck his head against an overhead compartment, and was killed instantly. Yet the disaster took more than just frontman Ronnie Van Zant. It also claimed the lives of guitarist Steve Gaines, who perished on impact, backing vocalist Cassie Gaines, who was thrown from the wreckage and died soon after, the band's road manager, Dean Kilpatrick, who was discovered deceased in a swamp, and the 2 pilots, Walter McCreary and William Gray. Although most of the survivors had been seated in the back section of the aircraft, every one of them sustained major injuries. Keyboardist Billy Powell endured grave wounds, including a nose that was almost completely severed and deep cuts to his face and legs, which caused him to nearly bleed to death. Guitarist Gary Rossington fractured both of his arms, both of his legs, both of his wrists, both of his ankles, and his pelvis. Drummer Artemis Pyle sustained multiple broken ribs in the accident. Despite his own severe injuries, Pyle somehow found a way to traverse the difficult landscape of a swampy creek and a dark field to get to a farmhouse nearby for assistance. It was growing dark and a helicopter was circling overhead looking for survivors, but with no fire, there was no beacon to guide them. Pyle pressed on, climbing over a barbed wire fence and suffering puncture wounds in the attempt. But as he neared the farmhouse, a man came out holding a rifle. The man shouted, "Halt!" Pyle, who was in a state of shock, continued stumbling forward. The farmer then fired, hitting him in the left shoulder and causing him to twist and fall to the ground. The shot spun him around, and he went down, thinking these might be his last moments. Struggling for air, he was able to choke out the words, "Plane crash." The farmer hurried to his aid, immediately apologizing for the terrible mistake. He brought Pyle into his home, where a number of curious farm children had gathered. Emergency services quickly arrived on the scene and transported all the survivors to different hospitals. A local volunteer firefighter later described the horrific wreckage, noting that he had actually tripped over several victims who were still alive. In the chaos of that day, those who survived were not immediately told about who had been lost. Gary Rossington, for example, did not know about Ronnie Van Zant's death for several days, only finding out when his mother relayed the devastating news. In the subsequent investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the probable cause of the accident was fuel exhaustion and the complete failure of both engines, stemming from the flight crew's failure to monitor the fuel supply. Contributing factors to the fuel exhaustion were insufficient flight planning and an undetermined malfunction in the right engine that led to abnormally high fuel consumption. However, the NTSB also clarified that the engine issue itself was likely not a catastrophic failure. While the examination of the engine and its parts did not pinpoint the exact problem, the safety board determined that the issue was probably a general one, such as a problem with the ignition or induction system, and not a significant mechanical breakdown. In the end, the National Transportation Safety Board's final report attributed the crash to the flight crew's failure to monitor the fuel supply. Tragically, the band's history of misfortune did not conclude with this event. In 1986, a severe automobile accident left founding member and guitarist Alan Collins paralyzed. His girlfriend was killed on impact. Collins passed away on January 23, 1990, from persistent pneumonia, a complication arising from his paralysis. The band's bassist at the time of the crash, Leon Wilkson, was discovered deceased in his hotel room on July 27, 2001. His death was caused by emphysema and chronic liver disease, further extending the band's tally of sorrows. In 2009, keyboardist Billy Powell died following a heart attack. The original lineup of Lynyrd Skynyrd effectively reached its end when Gary Rossington, the last surviving founding member, passed away on March 5, 2023. So the official report closed the case. But it could never explain the premonitions, the eerie choices, or the echoes of a tragedy that seemed destined to unfold. Was it fate, a series of unforgivable errors, or something stranger? Let us know in the comments below, and stay tuned for more terrifying histories.